2. Banter between the king and the prince.
So if the queen's life were threatened, would Prince Kodey be motivated enough to do what he needed to keep her alive? Even though he doesn't feel like he is indebted to her in the same way as the king, does he have enough respect for her? I always saw Jennifer and Prince Kodey having some sort of love relationship due to the fact that you and Jen are playing him. Well, you kind of gave her your sword, and so
I think that was primarily because like the giving away of Longclaw was due to her not having anything to fend for herself with. She was kind of this like this character of I don't want to be in the battle, and I don't really have the skills to be in the battle. And at a point in season 1, it was kind of like you live or you die. And that realization...
I mean, that was every single weekend that we played.
Yeah, you live or you die. And at that point, when the prince got Dusk back, he handed over Longclaw so she could stay alive. Because the sword she had was inadequate for the task at hand.
Because it wasn't Quicksilver, right?
Yeah, well, so Longclaw wasn't Quicksilver either.
But you forged it.
We forged it.
Yeah.
To where Longclaw is now the property of the queen and the prince. So either house can hold that sword. So I think that kind of is a cool unifying thing. But I think Jen will tell you the same thing. The two characters don't have a love interest.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't believe you, but okay.
I promise.
Would you be motivated? Would the prince, would he be motivated to do whatever is necessary to protect her?
I think that comes down to why is she being, like, is something he did a result of, like, her imminent death? Because, I mean, right now it doesn't seem like he would even, like, be in the know of what's going on in the New Valley. He's keeping to himself, doesn't get ravens, you know. Not even sure ravens would fly in that path anymore. But no, I don't think he really just feels any obligation to a new regime. Which is why he turns down Damien when Damien comes in and seeks him out and says, "Hey, we want you," like Uncle Sam. "We want you for the Knights of Meraxis." He just feels no obligation to do that.
However, he wanted the party to be safe from harm from Damien, so he hands over the sword. So that's what I'm kind of getting at is if he does that for the party, which is a small glimpse of who he was, you're seeing that small, it's almost like the mirror dimly lit, like you're looking and you're seeing this small fragment of who the prince actually was, which is controversial to say, but he was actually a very compassionate character towards those who were loyal to the crown, those who he deemed his friends. You see that a little bit when he makes that decision to give over his brother's sword, the reforged sword of Daylight. And then what you have happen is Damien says basically, the sword's not good enough, now I'm going to take your life too. If the prince was in that situation again, or if it was a similar situation with like the queen, would the prince do something?
I think the only reason the prince necessarily did that is because he knew they were still outnumbered. So the prince alone could not take on Damien and the harrowing, at least in his current state. It's, you know, being one-armed, he's worn down. You know, he's not in. I don't think he's in the right place to take on a fight of that magnitude, because I mean we all saw, you know, Damien fight Sabes and Angelo, and I mean that was a pretty intense fight. I think the prince could hold his own against Damien, and I think they would come to a standstill. But I think the prince would lose, in turn making everyone else lose against Damien, because he would be trying to protect them so they didn't die, because they are part of the new regime. So he has camaraderie towards Jared of House Stevens because they're brothers in arms. They grew up together at the castle, but now he's also part of the new regime. So it's like, well, I want to protect you for who you were, but I also want to get you out of here so you can do what you're supposed to do. So quick story too, because so sorry.
Oh, you're good.
But I don't know if anyone else noticed it. But the Jared of House Stevens actually found Longclaw, apart from the prince, and it was last seen with the prince. It was stabbed into some dude in a tree and just left there. And Jared of House Stevens found it, and when he found the prince, he's like, "Hey, I think I found your sword," and the prince is like, "That's not mine. Give that to its rightful owner," talking about the queen. So he's completely unhitched from that as well.
Well, that's good. A lot of good content there.
We hit some biblical allegories with the prince. Is there any more we can think of?
Yeah, so I kind of thought the prince kind of reflected Peter a lot. Just in the fact of, like, when he's following the king, he's real hopeful, and he's brash, and he's kind of arrogant. And then when the king dies, just like Peter, the prince is kind of shattered and goes about living in hopelessness for a long period of time. And then early church history would then recall Peter becomes the apostle of hope. His messages to the church in Jerusalem and the churches he traveled to in the book of Acts demonstrate that with his sermons of Jesus Christ and hope. So I'm hoping to get to that point with the prince where you're seeing that kind of full 180 flip.
That's a cool comparison there too that I don't know that I made, but you even see that with him bringing up like the Civil War, which we didn't get to play out as much as we wanted to, just a lot due to lack of resources and so on, as GMs and telling the story and players and everything. But you almost see the denial of Jesus that Peter does 3 times. You almost see that played out with the Civil War storyline, that very small storyline that we saw with the king, where you see the prince turn on the king. And it's very similar, now that you're mentioning Peter, it's very similar to that, where Peter communicates to Jesus he would never turn on him, and Jesus is the one that tells Peter, like, you're going to deny me 3 times. And what you have then happen is the prince, with the character of the prince, like, the prince was all for the king. The prince, every motive he was making was because the valley needed to stand strong, needed to be united under the king. Though he didn't agree or understand all of the decisions King James was making, he continued to communicate to the king, I'm with you, I'm for you, I believe in you, I trust you. And then you see this one moment where everything that the king has done is essentially not turned out the way in which the prince thinks it should have, or the way that the prince would have done it. And he's reached this point where he's done with it. Mm-hmm. And he knows that he can get his people and the pines to rally around him, and he is, in his eyes, you're seeing the prince saying, for the greater good, the valley needs to stand. I'm going to do whatever it takes, even if that means going against my brother, whom I've communicated multiple times is the rightful heir. I will become a king, and he becomes the king of the north. And it's very similar what you see with Peter when he denies Jesus 3 times to the girl, and the other individuals that Peter denies Jesus to. And then what's interesting, when you have that Avengers Assemble moment after the prince has just been fighting his way through from the pines, and they're on top of Versailles looking down, and you almost have this, like, Jesus, when Peter had denied him, Jesus makes him affirm him 3 times as well. And you almost had a similar instance with the king and the prince when they met back up after the Civil War had taken place, you have this affirmation again from the prince to the king of, I'm with you, I trust you, I believe in you, I have failed you, but I promise I'm going to do what I need to do.
Yeah, that actually, it really reminded me of the betrayal of Edmund in Narnia. I honestly, so that scene happened that weekend, and I was thinking about it. I think Jen and I had just watched Narnia, and I had just read the book, and I was just like, oh my gosh, like, this is so beautiful. And in the movie, it's so great because Aslan and Edmund are like walking side by side, you know, and they're talking about the implications of Edmund's betrayal and the implications of the prince's betrayal. He united a people who would not unite under the crown, but he led them to destruction, right? And then coming together with the king, all the forces that pledged allegiance to the prince then had to pledge allegiance to the king, but they were so scarce because of the Great Bastion Fear that it just it was either that or die, you know. And then you see Aslan kind of, you know, comforting Edmund, and that actually happened between the prince and the king. We were walking on the road with Jared of House Stevens, and you kind of did this thing. You're like, what do we say to people who won't bend the knee? Against, and at that point you just see unity of mind between the prince and the king, and we didn't let anything stop us from that point on.
Yeah, and you even see with the fall of the Great Bastion Fear, I mean, you saw the king's plea right when it's actually Hammerfell. When Hammerfell is destroyed by the others, and the prince originally turns on the king. The king is in disbelief and is actually begging the prince to quit with the decision. He killed Ogden Stormcrow, which was the representative of the marshlands, the united marshlands under the crown. And the king was begging the prince not to do that. And even you had Briar, and I think Jennifer Skinnifer and Aira were with me. Skinnifer may or may not have been with me. But you have, I know for sure, Aira and Briar were with me, and they're communicating, we're going to kill the prince. Can't believe you did that, we're going to kill the prince. And the king's like communication to them as we're walking away from that, the king, I remember communicating to both of them, this is what he does, this is his nature, but he will come back. And so I never made the parallel of Peter until you communicated that, and even the beautiful imagery that you see in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with Aslan walking with Edmund. There was a part where you have that Avengers Assemble moment, and the prince is on the ground, and the king had walked up and reached down and lifted the prince up off the ground. And even within that moment, they're like reconciling to one another. And there wasn't a whole lot spoken in that moment, not to the same beautiful degree you see within the Chronicles of Narnia, but it is a communication between both of the brothers where they understand we're back where we need to be. And the king actually then in that moment pardons the prince for his crimes against the crown, and he does it in front of everyone on top of the mountaintop on purpose, which is ultimately what you see done within the Chronicles of Narnia, where Aslan is communicating essentially his blood has to be spilt on behalf of Edmund, because Edmund has dealt in deep magics that have to be fulfilled now. He has been a traitor, and a traitor must pay the price with blood. And that's what you ultimately see within the gospel. We are traitors to a holy, righteous God, and the price is blood for sin. And you see this beautiful parallel with the king where he has pardoned the iniquities and the sins of the prince, and then even puts the prince back in a position of lead my armies. And the entire time what's cool about the king is he doesn't care about the politics as the prince did. He doesn't care about who's rebelling against him, so on and so forth. All he cares about, the driving motive for the king was army of the living versus army of the dead. Everything else doesn't matter if the army of the dead wins. And so even within that moment, the king is enlisting him to fight for the living, which is the same thing that Jesus does to us when we are saved, Jesus enlists us in the army of the living to fight against the army of the dead with the only weapon that can actually defeat it. In our storyline, it's Quicksilver, but within the legitimate storyline of all of God's redemptive history, it's the gospel. And so we're given the weapon, the sword, to fight against the forces of evil with the gospel, which is the sword, the word of God. Yeah. And so that's kind of a cool parallel that you pointed out that is definitely there. Maybe not intentionally, but definitely there.
Yeah, so I think even with the prince's like minor rebellion, it also in essence kind of pushed the king to be a more firm king than he had been. And I think we see that because it's like, well, even my brother thinks, something's wrong. And because the prince's rebellion was in the fact of what I communicated earlier, he had been raised to defend this lineage, defend this monarch, and he was raised to believe this is the monarch that will lead into prosperity, kind of theonomic sense. And then looking at, I honestly, I think from my point of view, I saw just a shift in the king. He was way more decisive. He was way more firm, and I think that that tension between the prince and the king led us to where we needed to be, and we're actually unified on the top of Mount Ursine. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, you see the king all the way back in season 1. It was probably the second act of season 1 was the first time you saw the king. Because all of Act 1 focused on the prince and that entirely too large party.
Fun though.
It was awesome, but there were so many player characters, and what you end up seeing is a lot of those player characters are brought into the Lion's Guard, and they're knighted into the Lion's Guard. But then you see the removal of Lord Commander from the prince, and so you see the king is kind of laying down the law. But as the king starts to understand...
Well, even that was kind of a formality because of Tila.
That's true, yeah. Tila was pushing for that to be removed.
Cause disunity and to take out the leadership.
You have the king, when he starts to find out more information about this army of the dead, he's encountering the sovereign more, he's spent more time in the White Woods. His guide, Aera Sigmund, is kind of influencing him more, not necessarily in a bad way, but more so he's uncultured. He's never been around half-elves or elves. He's done all the training the prince has done, minus the ranger training, but he's been the figurehead of the valley, and he's been ruling since his father died at Ursine. It's kind of been thrusted upon him. And as he figures out the army of the dead is coming, he's more focused on the army of the dead than the political side of this family has rebelled against us, so on and so forth. And even the battle at the Red Keep when Beowulf's army comes. It's not that the king is not concerned about the fact that an invading army is coming.
Well, the king kind of came late on that one.
He comes late on that one because he's off on Mount Ursine. He's on top of it, becoming a living runestone. And it's not that he's not concerned that his people are being attacked. He's just aware there's a greater threat than even Beowulf. And so you see the character of the king kind of start to develop more and more as the story goes along, where a lot of the decisions, again, the prince has the mindset of this monarch is the only thing that's going to lead this people into prosperity. As for the king, has the mindset of, if we don't defeat the army of the dead, there will be no prosperity. Mm-hmm. The dead will live and reign, and the living will be dead. Like, there's no hope. And so the king holds out for hope, where the prince is really just looking to something that is not necessarily hopeful. And we see that. The prince's idol of this monarchy is crushed when the king sacrifices himself against the other king. He destroys all of the others and destroying himself. And, his decisions and everything that led the king up to that point was ultimately for every single individual in Aspiria to be able to have life.
I think just breaking it down like that, you kind of see the prince taking a role like Israel, in a sense, where they're looking for this political Messiah, this warrior Messiah to come, right? And that's not what has to happen at all. At first, the Old Testament clearly lays out the need for a sacrifice on behalf of the covenant Israel, on behalf of the redeemed people of God. And I think looking at everything as an overview, it reminds me of the failure of Israel to see the Messiah's first coming as the atoning work for Israel, and then the Messiah's second coming, which they believed was the first coming, as the vindication of Israel.
You almost see similarity too between the constant rebellions that are going on within the political side of the storyline versus the army of the dead. It's almost a physical war versus a spiritual war, much like you're communicating, where Israel is looking and only thinking physical.
Mm-hmm.
They're only thinking about the fact that God has promised land, and God has promised they will rule over nations, and so on and so forth. And they're not really understanding, as you're getting at, all the implications that the Old Testament is actually communicating. And the king has his mindset almost as if we were to break down the king and the prince. The prince is Old Testament and New Testament Jews. And the king, if I may, would be like a disciple of Christ, or would be like the New Testament kind of understanding of it, maybe a Christian nowadays, understanding the entirety of it. We see Jesus like illustrations and allusions within the character of the king, and he is definitely flawed as a character. There's a lot of things he did that...
It's kind of like Peter from Narnia.
Yeah.
Because in Peter's reign, Narnia experienced the most flourishing. And then, because you see in, I think it's Caspian, just the downfall after Peter's reign.
Yeah, as soon as Peter leaves, you have High King Peter, right? Because Edmund's a king, and then Lucy and Susan. But as soon as Peter leaves, Caspian takes over, his family line takes over, and ultimately we see the decline of Narnia as a result of that. Same thing where you have, except almost inverted, King James, races are divided. You have essentially
King
nothing,
James the First.
The first, yeah. You have nothing but quarreling and rebellion and so on. And so if you think King James II was bad with all of these houses that wanted to come against him and take the crown, it's nothing compared to King James I.
It's definitely nothing compared to Paul.
That's also true. But then you get into the fact that King James, as a king, unites elves. We see dwarves are united under the crown. We see marshlanders who don't even claim alliance or allegiance to a king themselves within the marshlands. I mean, Beowulf was the first monarch-like figure they had, and Beowulf even falls. But you see marshlanders uniting, you see elves uniting, you see pinesmen uniting, you see even some people from the Blackwoods are coming and uniting. Jennifer Skinnifer brings an entire people group to unite with the king. You have Bryn of House Knox, who actually orchestrates the entirety of the rebellion with Queen Tila, and yet he has given himself over to the king and dies for the king to see that played out. And so you see, even though there's war going on, you see the king able to unite a people that normally would not be united. And that's the beautiful, like the imagery you see there's the beautiful truth of the gospel in which Christ unites us, people who normally would not be united, together. We're talking about a LARP podcast right now, and in Discipleship Circle, our brother Casey's always talking about how he would never be friends with us. He plays football. He would never be friends with us, but because of Jesus, he loves us dearly. And it's the same way. I would never be friends with a guy who plays football like he does normally. But because of Jesus, I love that guy. And that's what you see is so beautiful within the gospel. And that's something that is so interesting about the character of King James and how the story played out. You don't see that with the prince. People don't want to unite because of the prince.
Besides for the Pines.
Sure, besides for the Pines, but even the Pines were having issues, right? There were issues. I mean, it traces all the way back to the Felix family.
Yeah, Hunter, what are you doing?
There are issues within the Pines, and they don't even want to unite under the king. They're doing it out of formality. And then once that formality is broken, Hunter Felix's secrets and lies have gotten out. What you have going on is then civil war, because you've got those who want to keep the formality versus those who don't, and so you've got that entire chasm going on. But that's an interesting dynamic you see between both the prince and the king, and that's something I would love to see the prince actually grow in. When we become Christians,
I have some ideas.
Okay, good. When we become Christians, we want to grow into the likeness of Christ, and in the same vein, the prince of the king. It's cool that Jesus is described as our big brothers in the scriptures, because we can look up to our big brother, Jesus, and we can look to him and want to follow his example in the same way. Not only is he Lord, he is friend and brother. And in the same way, you see so many allusions to the gospel within the character of the king. And so it would be cool to see the prince grow as a character as he's looking to a lot of the decisions he disagreed with. And no doubt the disciples of Christ disagreed with decisions that Jesus was making, right? I think of the time when Jesus had just talked to the woman at the well, and he refuses to eat, and he's alluding to the fact that he has all that he needs in God, but the disciples are pushing him and pushing him and pushing him. We just talked about it in Circle last week.
Or when Jesus is anointed by I think the Marys, and Judas is like, we could have used that.
We could have used it. We could have sold it. It could have gone for the ministry. So no doubt Jesus makes decisions that his disciples don't understand and disagree with. And then when his disciples, those who are truly his disciples, Judas would never understand it, they start to understand, oh, everything Jesus was doing was leading up to this point. And it would be cool to see the prince kind of hit this state of, everything the king did led up to this point, and let me follow in the footsteps of my big brother and walk in some of these areas in which he really excelled in.
I have some ideas involving the dwarves, so
that'll be cool.
Yeah, very cool. Ethan,
I got distracted.
Any ideas? Any thoughts?
I don't know if I have anything else to add. You guys hit it like pretty well. Like imagery with Peter, I wouldn't have thought of that in the allegory to him.
You asked that question.
I did, but I wasn't imagining that. I want to make sure we got into some biblical allegory.
Oh yeah. I had it all stored up. I was ready for it.
I want to thank you guys for listening on the prince and getting to flesh him out and seeing that he's not just a big jerk that's going to pull his sword the first moment anyone gets mad, but is actually pretty compassionate, and evidences Arn and other people in the party we saw during season 3 that he stepped in to rescue him from Damien. We hope you're looking at LARP and looking at it with Christ at the center of your mindset and seeing where Christ is reflected in the story, or it's not, where the Bible is reflected, biblical allegories, and not just in LARP. We're hoping you see that in other forms of media as well. That's what we got for today, and we didn't even touch Meraxis. So, thank you guys for listening, and keep Christ at the center of your lives.
Later.
Okay, bye.
Slounced. Damn. Drax.